Nobody told me about the cloth. That is the first thing I remember, standing in the staging area behind the palace forecourt at 6:30 in the morning, press credential around my neck, notepad already open, and watching a man in a scarlet tunic carefully, methodically, wrap his drum in black fabric. Not a quick wrap, not a practical wrap. The kind of wrap you give something you are about to carry into a cathedral, fold by fold, corner by corner. His hands moved the way hands move when they have done this before, and understand that doing it correctly is the only thing that matters right now. I had expected noise. I want to be honest about that because it shapes everything that follows. I had covered state occasions before: the trooping of the color twice, a Commonwealth ceremony at St. Paul's, one very chaotic state visit from a head of government I am not permitted to name, and all of them had a certain organized chaos to them in the hours before. Officers with clipboards, radio chatter, someone always slightly lost, slightly behind, slightly at odds with the schedule. The productive, human disorder that precedes precision. There was none of that here. The forecourt held perhaps 300 people, soldiers, drummers, cavalry, bearer party, officers, and the sound they produced collectively was somewhere between a library and a chapel. Boots on stone. The occasional soft command, pitched low enough that it carried no further than its target. The horses were already there, already still, in the way horses go still when the humans around them have gone still first. I watched a guardsman adjust the chin strap of the man beside him without being asked, without acknowledgement, without either of them breaking their forward gaze. The adjustment happened. The strap was correct. The world continued. I wrote in my notepad, "Where is the person running this?" I looked for a conductor. That is the only word I have for what I was searching for. Every large human undertaking I had ever covered had one, the figure at the center, the one whose attention everything orbited, the one who made decisions in real time and whose stress was visible in their jaw and their stride. A film set has a director. A hospital trauma bay has a charge nurse. A military parade, I assumed, had a senior officer somewhere forward, watching, adjusting, commanding. I found no one who fit that description. What I found instead, when I finally stopped scanning the officers and looked back at the man with the drum, was that he had finished wrapping it. He was standing very still. He was not looking at anyone. He was not checking anything. He was simply present in the way that objects are present rather than the way people usually are. His drum hung at his side. The black cloth was smooth. His expression was the expression of someone who has arrived exactly where they intended to be and has nothing left to arrange. I asked the press liaison who had walked me in, a pleasant, efficient woman named Helen, who had been answering my questions for 40 minutes with the patient precision of someone who had answered them all before. I asked her who was coordinating the pace of the procession. She said, "The drummer." I said, "Right, but who coordinates the drummer?" She looked at me the way people look at you when they realize the question you have asked reveals a misunderstanding so fundamental that answering it directly will take longer than they have available. Then she said, "Go and ask Sergeant Granger. He'll be over by the gun carriage. Tell him I sent you." I went and asked Sergeant Granger. Sergeant Granger was a man of approximately 50, built like a wardrobe that had decided to become a soldier, with a face that had clearly spent decades outdoors and eyes that were performing 3 different calculations simultaneously. He listened to my question, who coordinates the pace? And then he was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are deciding how much of the true answer to give. He said, "The drum is in charge." I wrote that down. I looked at what I had written. I said, "I don't think I understand what that means." He almost smiled. "You will," he said, "in about 4 hours." He was not wrong. The thing about military precision, the thing nobody tells you before you stand inside it for the first time, is that it does not look like what you imagine. You imagine rigidity. You imagine officers at every node of the system, watchful and corrective. The whole apparatus held taut by human will applied from above. What you get instead, standing in the staging area while the procession assembles, is something closer to the behavior of a murmuration, the kind of movement that has a logic you can feel before you can see it. Each element finding its place, not because it was directed there in that moment, but because the preparation was so complete that direction in the moment is almost beside the point. I spent the next 40 minutes trying to find the answer Sergeant Granger had declined to give me in full. I asked a young guardsman near the rear of the formation who set the tempo. He pointed, without hesitation, toward the front. I made my way forward and asked the same question of a corporal near the gun carriage. He pointed, also without hesitation, toward the drummer. I asked the drummer's immediate superior, a quiet, watchful officer named Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth, who had the bearing of a man who had been awake since 3 in the morning and had decided to treat this as normal, and he said, "The drummer sets the pace. Everyone else follows the drummer." I said, "But who tells the drummer what pace to set?" Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth looked at me with an expression I can only describe as gently corrective. "He knows," he said. "He was told in training." "He was trained," Ashworth said, "and then he practiced and then he knew. Those are 3 different things." I tried a different approach. I found a veteran who had marched in 2 previous state funerals, a retired color sergeant named Davies who was now watching from inside the staging area as a civilian observer, invited back in the way that institutions sometimes invite back the people who built them. He had the look of a man watching something he loves being done correctly, and finding this both satisfying and slightly unbearable. I asked him about the drum. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When you're in the formation, you don't hear the drum the way you'd hear music. You feel it. It comes through the ground, through the cobblestones, up through your boots. The beat is so slow, slower than a resting heartbeat. Did you know that? And your body just acquires it, like a temperature. You don't decide to match it. You match it because it's inside you and it would feel wrong to be elsewhere." I asked him what would happen if the drummer faltered. He looked at me. "Don't write that question down." He said, "It doesn't happen." "But hypothetically." "It doesn't happen," he said again, pleasantly, with the absolute finality of a man who has just closed a door. I wrote it down anyway. I circled it. I kept it for Phase 5, which is where it belongs. What I did instead, for the remainder of the assembly period, was watch the drummer. His name, I learned later, not that morning, but later, through the research that happens after you have seen something and need to understand it, was Corporal James Whitfield. He had been with the Household Division for 14 years. He had been assigned to the State Funeral Drum Detail 11 years ago, which means he was assigned to it 3 years before there was a state funeral to perform it at. This is how these things work. The preparation is not scaled to the probability of the event. The preparation is scaled to the weight of the event, and the weight of this one was absolute, and so the preparation had been absolute. And so for 11 years Corporal Whitfield had practiced a single rhythm, 100 beats per minute, precisely, muffled, measured, until the rhythm and the man were no longer separable things. I did not know any of this yet that morning. What I knew that morning was that he was very still, and that his stillness was different from the stillness of everyone around him. The other soldiers were still in the disciplined way, controlled, maintained, the product of training overriding the body's natural inclination towards small movements. Whitfield was still in the way that a clock is still between ticks, not suppressing movement, simply not requiring it. I wrote in my notepad, "He is waiting for something only he can hear." I was wrong about that too, but I was getting closer. The procession began without announcement. That is the only way I know how to describe it. There was no command I could identify, no whistle, no signal, no officer raising a hand. One moment the formation was assembled and still. The next moment it was moving. The transition between those 2 states had no visible cause that I could name in the instant it happened, and by the time I had registered that movement had begun, it had already been underway long enough to be established. The drum was the cause. I know that now. At the time, standing at my designated press position along the route, I simply felt it. The beat arrived before the procession did, carried on the cold morning air of the mall, and something in my chest responded to it before my brain had processed what I was hearing. This is not a small thing. I want to be precise about it because it surprised me, and I think the surprise is part of the story. The tempo was slower than I expected. Not slow in the way that suggests hesitation or uncertainty. Slow in the way that a very large thing moves deliberately, with the weight of its own mass as a kind of authority. Each beat had space around it. Space that the procession filled with a single collective footfall. You could, if you concentrated, hear the moment when 200 boots found the ground as a single sound, and then the silence, and then the beat, and then the boots again. 106 steps per minute is what I was told afterward. I could not have told you the number in the moment. What I could have told you was that the number was exact. I watched the gun carriage pass. I watched the bearer party 8 soldiers of the Grenadier Guards, each chosen for matched height, each carrying a portion of a weight that was both physical and not, and they moved as a single organism, not in the approximate way that drill sometimes produces, where individuals are close enough to uniform that casual observation reads them as one. In the literal way, left foot and left foot and left foot and left foot, 8 times, landing as 1 foot. I have seen this in rehearsal footage and thought it was camera angle. Standing 6 feet from it on the mall, I can tell you it was not camera angle. The drum was doing this. Not through command, not through visual signal, through sound, through a beat so embedded in these men and women that their bodies had, over years of practice, learned to treat it as primary, not background, not accompaniment, foundation, the thing on which everything else was built. I found myself doing something I had not anticipated. I found myself holding my breath between beats, not consciously. My body made the decision and I noticed it after the fact, the way you notice you've been clenching your jaw. The rhythm had acquired me. I was inside it without having agreed to be. Around me, the crowd was silent in the extraordinary way that London crowds go silent when they choose to, which is different from the silence of a crowd that has been instructed to be quiet. An instructed silence has a tense, managed quality, people suppressing the impulse toward sound, aware of their suppression. This silence was the other kind. The kind that forms when a collective of strangers independently makes the same decision, and the decision happens to be stillness. Nobody told this crowd to be quiet. The drum did. I wrote in my notepad, standing on the mall with my pen moving very small because I did not want the scratch of it to be audible. The drum is not keeping pace with the procession. The procession is keeping pace with the drum. The drum was here first. The procession arrived to meet it. That was the misdirection I had been carrying for 3 hours, finally corrected. I had framed the question backward from the beginning. I had been asking who was following what. The answer was that everyone was following the drum and the drum was following nothing. Or rather, the drum was following something that was no longer present to follow, which is a different thing entirely, and which is the whole story. I learned about the walking pace over lunch, a press briefing in a side room near Westminster Hall, sandwiches on a tray nobody was really eating, a Ministry of Defense communications officer named Priya answering questions with the careful precision of someone navigating a field of things that can be said and things that cannot. The tempo, 106 steps per minute, or in some accounts 100, depending on which element of the procession you are measuring, was not arbitrary. It had not been selected from a range of acceptable options by a committee somewhere. It had been derived. The Queen had a walking pace. All people have a walking pace, a natural, habitual rhythm of stride that the body defaults to when unhurried. The Queen's had been observed, measured, recorded over decades of public ceremony, not as a morbid preparation, as a standard. This was the pace at which state occasions moved when she was present. This was the pace at which things happened when she was in the room. When she was no longer in the room, the pace remained. I wrote that down, and then sat with it for a moment before writing anything else. The drum was not simply keeping time. The drum was carrying a specific time, a human time, a particular person's time, derived from the rhythm of a body that had walked 10,000 public miles. Corporal Whitfield had practiced for 11 years not just to achieve precision, but to achieve her precision. His 106 beats per minute was not a metronome's measurement. It was an act of preservation. I asked Priya carefully, because I could feel the boundary of what was sayable, whether Whitfield had been told this when he was assigned, whether he understood at the beginning of 11 years of practice what exactly he was practicing. She said yes. I asked what that was like, to carry that for 11 years. She said you'd have to ask him. I didn't get to ask him that day. I asked him 6 weeks later by email through the regimental press office, and his answer was 3 sentences long. He said, "I was told what the tempo represented and I treated it as a responsibility. Every practice session I did, I thought about what I was holding. You don't practice a rhythm like that casually." 3 sentences. I have quoted them in full because every word is doing work, and I am reluctant to paraphrase them into something smaller than they are. There was one more thing I learned at that briefing that belongs in this phase of the story, because it changes the weight of everything that came after it. Whitfield had never performed this publicly before, not once. In 11 years of preparation, through 2 significant public rehearsals in which most of the procession had been walked at pace, the muffled drum had been represented by a stand-in, a training drummer, matching the tempo, so that Whitfield himself arrived at the day of the state funeral having practiced 10,000 times and performed 0. There is a word for this kind of readiness, but I am not sure English has quite the right one. The Japanese have shokunin, the craftsman whose mastery is so complete that the performance, when it comes, is simply the practice made public. I reached for something like that as I sat in that briefing room and processed what I had just been told. 11 years of private practice, 1 public performance, and the performance was this. The most watched, most documented, most consequential funeral procession in living British memory. The sandwiches remained largely uneaten. The room was very quiet. Outside, through a window too high to see through, London continued. I had been carrying the question since retired Colour Sergeant Davies told me not to write it down, which is, of course, exactly the kind of instruction that ensures a journalist writes something down and underlines it. What happens if the drummer loses the beat? I asked it, finally, of Lieutenant Colonel Ashworth, the same quiet officer from the staging area, late in the afternoon, after the procession had concluded, after the gun carriage had been walked its last public mile, and the bearer party had completed their work, and the crowd had begun the slow dispersal that follows a thing that cannot be unwitnessed. Ashworth had removed his cap. He was holding it at his side. He looked tired in the honest way of someone who has been operating at maximum precision for 8 hours and has now been given permission to be a person again. He thought about the question for longer than any of my other questions had required. Then he said, "Nothing mechanical fails. The horses don't stop. The gun carriage doesn't stop. The formation doesn't physically collapse. From a distance, for a moment, it might even look the same." I waited. He said, but the men would know, instantly, because the beat is inside them, has been inside them since training, since rehearsal, and the moment it became wrong, every single person in that procession would feel it in their body before their brain named it. And what happens then is not a mechanical failure. It's something else. It's like. He stopped. He was working toward a description that satisfied him and not quite reaching it. He said finally, "You know how in an orchestra, if the conductor drops the baton, the musicians don't all stop at once. They continue for a beat, 2 beats, because they know the music well enough. But they are now each alone with it, and you can hear that aloneness. The unity becomes approximate, and approximate is not the same thing, and every person in that hall knows immediately that something has changed even if they can't name what." I wrote all of that down. Then I asked him whether Whitfield knew this, whether Whitfield understood, standing at the front of that procession, that 200 people were anchored to him in a way that no mechanical system could replicate or replace. Ashworth said, of course he knew. I asked if that was frightening. Ashworth looked at me with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years in close proximity to people who do frightening things, and has developed a very specific patience for civilians who ask about it. He said, what Corporal Whitfield would tell you if you asked him that directly is that the preparation removes the fear. That by the time you have practiced something 10,000 times, fear is not the relevant response. The relevant response is attention. He put his cap back on. He looked toward the street. But yes, he said more quietly, I imagine it was frightening, and I imagine he did not allow that to be relevant. Those are not contradictory things. I have thought about that exchange more than almost anything else from that day. The idea that something can be frightening and that this fact can be simultaneously true and set aside, not suppressed, not denied, but simply not given operational authority. I have heard soldiers describe courage before, and it usually sounds like the absence of fear. What Ashworth described sounded like its management. Fear present, acknowledged, and then placed somewhere it could not interfere with the work. The work in this case being 106 beats per minute, for the length of a mile, in front of 4 billion people, carrying a tempo that belonged to someone who was no longer there to walk it. There is a concept, I reached for it in my notes that evening and have been reaching for it since, in certain traditions of music and ceremony, of the performer as vessel, not author, not originator, the thing that carries something larger than itself from one moment to the next. The tradition that requires the vessel to be so perfectly prepared that the carrying happens without interference, without interpretation, without the vessel's own presence becoming a disruption. The drummer who is so fully the rhythm that the rhythm forgets it needs a drummer. Whitfield achieved this. I know it because I was there and I felt the procession as a unified thing and did not. In the moment of feeling it, think of the man at the front with the stick. I thought of it as one movement, one sound, one organism expressing one grief. The drum was invisible in the way that the best structural elements are invisible. The load-bearing wall you don't notice until someone proposes removing it. That invisibility was not incidental. It was the goal. I almost missed it. That is the honest version of how the ending of this story goes, and I am committed to the honest version because I think the almost missing is as important as the seeing. I had moved back toward the dispersal area near the palace forecourt. Credentialed press were permitted into a holding zone as the procession elements returned, and I was watching the horses being led off, watching the gun carriage crew conduct their post-ceremony checks, watching the guardsmen stand down from the particular posture of formal duty and allow their shoulders to drop a fraction of an inch in the way that bodies do when the requirement of precision is lifted. I was watching all of this and making notes, and I nearly did not see Whitfield. He was to the left of the main dispersal, near the stone wall where the staging area met the forecourt access road, and he was doing something very simple. He was unwrapping the drum. The same hands that had wrapped it in the pre-dawn dark that morning were now revering the work, fold by fold, corner by corner, the black cloth coming away in the same deliberate sequence with which it had been applied. He was working alone. Nobody was assisting him or watching him or acknowledging him. The crowd that had lined the mall 6 deep was 400 meters away and diminishing. The cameras that had been broadcasting to 4 billion people were pointed elsewhere. The moment was as private as anything can be in the middle of central London. I watched him complete the unwrapping. He folded the cloth. He folded it with the same care he had used in the wrapping, corners meeting corners, edges aligned, the whole thing reduced to a precise rectangle that he tucked under his arm. He looked at the drum, bare now, the way it looked on any other day, the way it had looked for every one of 10,000 practice sessions that were now, finally, behind him. He stood there for a moment, just a moment. Then he walked away. No ceremony, no acknowledgement from the crowd because the crowd did not know what had just left. No officer came to shake his hand. No one on the press riser turned a camera. The man who had held the pace of the most watched state funeral in living memory, who had carried a dead queen's walking rhythm in his body for 11 years and delivered it without flaw for 1 mile across the center of London, walked out of the forecourt in the same direction as the catering staff and the additional security personnel and the 100 other people whose work was invisible and essential and now complete. I have thought in the weeks since about what that moment cost. Not the performance, the preparation. 11 years of practicing something you have not yet been asked to do. 11 years of maintaining a readiness whose occasion you cannot predict and cannot hurry. The discipline required for that is not the discipline of the performance. It is a stranger and quieter discipline, the kind that has no audience even in the imagination. You practice because the thing must be practiced. That is all. The occasion will come or it will not come. And the practice continues either way, because that is the nature of the responsibility you have accepted. There is a question underneath the question I went to answer that day. I want to find out how the pace was set technically, procedurally, institutionally. I found out, and the answer is, by a single muffled drum, played by a man who had practiced a single rhythm for a decade and deployed it once when it mattered most. That is the technical answer, and it is true, and it is also, I think, the least of the story. The more of the story is this: the reason it worked, the reason 200 people moved as one, and the crowd went silent, and 4 billion viewers around the world felt the weight of the thing they were watching. The reason for all of that was not the drum. The drum was the instrument. The reason was the preparation. The 10,000 practices that nobody saw. The decision, made 11 years earlier, to treat a single rhythm as a life's work until the moment arrived that required it to be more than practice. There is something in this that I have been reluctant to name directly, because the direct naming of it makes it sound smaller than it is. But here it is. The most important moment in the most watched funeral in recent history was held together by an act of readiness so complete that it became invisible. The work that mattered most was the work done in empty practice rooms in the years before by a man who could not know when or whether the day would come. He prepared as though it would. It did. He was ready. The drum was the instrument. The readiness was the miracle. Corporal James Whitfield folded his cloth and walked away, and the crowd had no idea he had been there. Somewhere between those two facts, the weight of what he carried and the silence that greeted his exit, is everything I have been trying to write since I stood on the mall that morning and felt a dead queen's walking pace move through the soles of my feet and up into my chest, and could not, at the time, explain why I was crying. I understand it now. The beat was hers. He kept it. For a mile, for a morning, for 11 years of preparation and one irreplaceable day, he kept it exactly as it had always been. And then he walked away, and the drum was just a drum again, and London closed around the silence like water.